Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Good morning, and thank you to our witnesses who are here today and for holding this hearing. I want to make sure that we understand today that we really need to have this discussion to combat financial fraud. And it is no secret. We've heard comments from our chair that fraud schemes are on the rise and the bad actors are now finding new and creative ways to defraud consumers. For example, the Federal Trade Commission data showed us that in 2024, American consumers lost more than $12.5 billion to fraud, a 25% increase from the previous year. Our constituents in red and blue districts alike are being robbed of their hard-earned savings, and I'm eager to work with my Republican colleagues to develop sharper tools to deter fraud folks and protect American consumers, starting with today's hearing. Although I appreciate the bipartisan approach to tackling this matter, we cannot ignore the stark contradictions between the goal of today's hearing and the Trump administration rollback of key financial crime measures that would help us detect and deter fraud. The president, along with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, is trying to unlawfully eliminate the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the agency, as you know, that's responsible for protecting Americans from fraud and abuse. The president announced that the United States will no longer enforce Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits Americans from bribing foreign officials. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, unilaterally announced that the department will not be enforcing the bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act, which President Trump signed into law during his first term against U.S. persons, exempting over 99% of the companies Congress intended the law to cover. Gutting the CTA eliminates a critical tool for law enforcement to detect and deter fraud cases that involve anonymous shell companies, effectively making the United States a haven for money launderers, traffickers, and fraudsters. Let me just give you an example. In 2022, 6 individuals were charged with scamming over 20,000 victims by tricking them into paying for tech repair services. Victims paid more than $10 million. I'm going to say that again. Victims paid more than $10 million to bank accounts tied to a network of shell companies. While I join my colleagues on the other side in calling out the need for key beneficial ownership reforms, the administration repeatedly chooses to gut the law entirely instead of working in a bipartisan manner to ease small business compliance burdens. In just 2 months, President Trump has made it easier for financial fraud to devastate hardworking families, particularly older adults, by unlawfully dismantling the pillars of our financial crime regulatory regime. While I, again, appreciate this hearing, I hope the discussion only underscores the vital significance of this regime and the need to preserve it if we were truly to prevent fraud and protect our constituents. And once again, to our witnesses, I hope that you can shed some light on this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Davidson and Ranking Member Beatty, for convening this hearing on fraud. U.S. fraud losses were estimated at nearly $13 billion in 2023. But many think the actual amount is much higher, especially for the 100 million Americans over age 50. Fraud is a serious threat to their secure retirement and well-being. Congress must take financial crime seriously. It must stand up for the tools it enacted, like the Bank Secrecy Act and Corporate Transparency Act, to detect fraud and hold fraudsters accountable. Congress must stand up for the bank examiners, investigators, prosecutors, agencies, and consumers that are under attack by the Trump regime and his billionaire cabinet. And we must end Trump's own schemes to defraud the American public using his meme coin and stable coin. I thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Liccardo is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for all this information. The hearing, of course, is captioned "Follow the Money," and I used to be involved in prosecuting drug traffickers and human trafficking as a federal prosecutor and later as a DA. And certainly I had plenty of challenges following the money when we knew there was information being provided by entities that was false, that would conceal who the actors were and who was controlling them, and most importantly, who was getting the money from the criminal enterprise, because we knew those were the folks who were really running the show. I'll give you a quick example. I remember a Cuban national who was controlling a major human trafficking enterprise in Southern California, of course, using entirely U.S. corporations filed under California and other states' laws with U.S. citizens, essentially, ostensibly being their officers. So I'm concerned, as I know the National District Attorneys Association is also concerned, based on what we see from their statement in December of 2024, at this legislation that we're currently considering that would exempt every U.S. corporation under a certain threshold size from Corporate Transparency Act's requirements providing basic basic ownership information to FinCEN. And let's be clear about what that information is under the law. It's the name of the owner, their date of birth, their address, and some identifying number from a driver's license or passport or some other government. That's it, 4 items. Now, in my experience, certainly trying to get the identity of those individuals controlling these entities that are engaged in criminal activity was pretty important. And I guess I just wanted to ask Stokes, does it help, based on your experience, to be able to have this kind of information if we're trying to combat fraud?
Thank you, Representative. Absolutely, the information is critical. And I just want to point out that we've heard a lot about concerns of administrative burden and concerns of data privacy. I want to turn to the burden of the victim. When you look in the aggregate of how much has been stolen just in 2023, an estimate from the FTC, $158.3 billion. That is 3 times the revenue of the Coca-Cola Company. We have to understand that, yes, there are burdens on businesses, and maybe some could be put together better than others, but we can't be moving away from rules that help protect consumers.
I agree, Ms. Stokes. And in fact, I believe Mr. Brabant suggested somehow or another corporations have to hire CPAs and outside counsel to be able to submit this information about the name of the owner, the date of birth, address, and their basic, driver's license number. Is that your experience, that you need outside counsel to do such things?
Thank you, Representative. I can't speak to that because that's not the space I work in, but I hear your point.
Yeah, so $153 billion in loss.
$158 billion.
$158 billion. Thank you for that. Mr. Brabant, you might have guessed I was going to you next. I'm trying to understand why providing these 4 basic pieces of information, which, by the way, I had to provide when I opened an LLC last year. Any bank would require it. It's pretty basic information. What is the extraordinary burden involved here?
It's also a photocopy of a driver's license, but it's that information. The challenge is the substantial control prong. And I think one thing that's getting lost here is that every bank already has this. So this is a duplication of the customer due diligence rule, which already exists. So every single LLC that has a bank, if the bank is doing its job, they have this information. What this is really
what happens if the
FBI
bank has individuals who are involved in the criminal activity? Wouldn't you want that information in the hands of those who are investigating criminal activity, not those who may be complicit?
Anyone who's investigating could subpoena the bank for it at any time.
And what happens if you're just investigating for the first time and you actually need to know who you can subpoena? You don't know exactly where to go because you don't have ownership information to begin with. I mean, you raise concerns, for example, about criminal threats to these companies, but in fact, the law is very clear under Title 31. Penalties only accrue if you're fraudulently reporting this information, willfully and fraudulently reporting information that is false. And somehow or another, you've cast this as some kind of great criminalization of corporate America. How can that be?
That's a knowing and willing standard, which is usually in the eye of a prosecutor.
Not knowing and willing. It says willfully provide false or fraudulent. That's what the statute says. Not knowing, it says willfully. Let's be very clear about what the statute says.
The gentleman's time has expired.